Hello and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we will be discussing Yom HaShoah, which is the Hebrew name for the Holocaust Memorial Day, in which this week Israel and the Jewish people around the world remembered the horrendous loss of 6 million precious Jewish lives at the hands of the Nazis. This year's theme was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943. Some very brave and courageous Jewish fighters resisted the Nazis for 27 days in the Warsaw Ghetto. And this program is dedicated to them and also the other 6 million Jews who died at the hands of the Nazis in the Holocaust. And in today's program, I'm joined by Melissa Briggs, also famously known as Stephen Briggs's wife. So it's great to have you on the program, Melissa. Melissa, can you share something about your background, how you came to know the Lord, how the Lord placed a real love for Israel and the Jewish people on your heart, and in particular, the passion you have to learn about the Holocaust and share what you've learnt in the case of doing an MA in Jewish civilization and specializing in the Holocaust and anti-Semitism.
Hello, Simon. Pleasure to be here. As you'll probably hear, I'm originally from Chicago, and I went to Israel to study at the Hebrew University, and that's where I met Stephen and how I ended up in England. Stephen's English, of course. And from a very young age, I decided to follow Jesus, and also from a young age, I became very interested in the Holocaust, and I just had a real sense early on of how significant the Holocaust was, how significant it was to the Father heart of God, the grief of the loss of the 6 million precious lives, how close that was to the Father's heart. And as I grew up, I became more and more interested in it, and some really significant points, turning points that solidified my desire to study the Holocaust and the history of anti-Semitism was firstly meeting a real life Holocaust denier. And the Holocaust is one of the most documented events in the world, and the Nazis themselves were documenting it. There's hours and hours of footage that the Germans filmed themselves, proud of what they were doing. And there's just millions of eyewitnesses, survivors, perpetrators, people from the army that saw what happened. And so there's no doubt historically that the Holocaust is a true event that really happened. But sadly, there's many people in the world today that say that's not true, that it didn't happen. And I met this lady in the States that was even alive while the Holocaust was going on. She was of my grandparents' generation, and her husband was even fighting in the war while the Holocaust was going on, and she believed that it hadn't happened, that the Jews had fabricated it to gain sympathy. And hearing that and knowing that there was other people in the world like her that were trying to say the Holocaust never happened, that really fired me up and filled me with passion as a lover of history and someone who knew that, no, this is true, this did happen, and this is important to remember and to stand up for the truth. That really inspired me in my desire to study the Holocaust. And then also, I had the opportunity to work at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and meet many Holocaust survivors and to hear their stories. And just this realization that this generation of Holocaust survivors are sadly passing on, and who's going to remember their stories and keep passing on their stories, and had the sense that it's important to be a second-generation witness. I got to meet these eyewitnesses and hear their stories and know that they're true. And I want to share those stories with other people.
Oh, fantastic. I remember when I was younger that my dad was always very interested in what happened in the Holocaust. And I remember even as a young child going out for walks with my dad and our dog then. His name was Smudge. And as we were going, my dad would tell me stories about the Holocaust. So for me, that also was from a young and early age. And then when the Lord really placed Israel upon my heart, I didn't want to look into the Holocaust at the time because I wanted to concentrate, because I thought it was too black, it's too dark. And I want to focus on the success and the power behind the Jewish state and Israeli history. So it hasn't been until you realise that you have to have an understanding of the Holocaust. In the course of your studies, and it's a difficult subject to actually study, the Shoah, the Holocaust, and it is the bleakest period of world history. It certainly scars the Jewish heart and the Jewish mind, and it casts a dark shadow over the Jewish people, even today, 70 years on. But one thing that I think changes you, like you said, when you actually meet Holocaust survivors, and I've had the pleasure of interviewing 5 Holocaust survivors now on Revelation TV. It's like when you interview them, you become part of their story and you understand the story, and it has a profound impact upon you. But what have you learnt in the course of your studies and experience about the Holocaust and what happened that you can share with us?
Well, there's a few things that, as a Christian, that I'd like to point out to other Christians that really were helpful to me in putting the Holocaust into context. And the roots of anti-Semitism are a really complex issue, and I don't claim to explain all of it now, but I think one aspect that's important to understand is that Satan hates what God loves, and it's very clear in the scriptures that God loves the Jewish people, that he has a special heart for them, that they're the apple of his eye, and Satan hates them. And he also knows that through the Jewish people, the Messiah, the redemption of mankind, would be coming. And as soon as God proclaims in the book of Genesis 12, that through the Jewish people, he will bless all the families of the earth, and through Abraham and his seed, the Messiah, the redemption of mankind would come. Satan starts warring against the Jewish people from that point. And you see so many times throughout history that Satan is trying to exterminate the Jewish people. He's trying to prove God a liar. God has said that the Jewish people will be a people before him as long as the moon and the stars and the sun are in the sky. We know that those things still are in the sky today. It says this in Jeremiah 31, that the Jewish people will continue to be a people before him. God has promised that he will keep and protect the Jewish people, and that they will be ongoing through history. And Satan desires to prove God a liar. And this is one aspect, I believe, as a Christian, of what's going on, that Satan is trying to thwart God's word, God's plan that involves the Jewish people, that says they will continue to be a people. And that's an important aspect to understand.
Absolutely, looking at the spiritual dynamics and dimensions of it all. Melissa, it was a real privilege that Katie and I were invited this week to attend the official memorial service at Yad Vashem. And what was so moving was to see all the soldiers there, and so many of the dignitaries. I mean, we heard speeches by the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Shimon Peres. And Netanyahu vowed that Holocaust would never happen again under his watch. And so it's so important that we remember and that we pay tribute to those precious lives that are lost. And we've got a clip to go to now that looks at how Israel remembered Yom HaShoah this week in Jerusalem and the rest of Israel.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry laid a wreath at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem as Israel marked its annual Holocaust Remembrance Day. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, President Shimon Peres, and a number of Holocaust survivors also attended the ceremony. The day was observed across Israel with a siren, which, for 2 minutes, brought life to a standstill. In Hanover, Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel and Russian President Vladimir Putin laid a wreath at a memorial to concentration camp inmates, forced workers, and prisoners of war. In Poland, several thousand people, including Holocaust survivors and Jewish youth from across the world, took part in the March of the Living at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the former Nazi death camp.
I feel hate first, but I feel also happy because we are all Jews here, and it's like you didn't do it. We are here and we are still alive.
As many as 1.5 million people, mostly Jews, perished at the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp, either in the gas chambers or from freezing temperatures, starvation, sickness, medical experimentation, and forced labor.
Look on the history, look what happened. Try, you people, young generation, to avoid hatred, bitterness, and be more tolerant to each other.
Israel's annual Holocaust Remembrance Day coincides with the Hebrew date of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, when Jews rebelled against the Nazis in occupied Poland. Poland was home to Europe's largest Jewish community of some 3.2 million before World War II, but just a tiny percentage of that number remained by the end of the war.
Yes, carry. זר עיריית ירושלים מתכבד להזמין
Welcome back to the Middle East Report, and that clip was Yom HaShoah, the memorial service at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. Melissa, what I want to ask you really is that there's been a new report that's come out. I got the copy of the Jerusalem Post, and it was produced by Tel Aviv University, the Cantor Center for the Study of Contemporary European Jewry. And what they do is they monitor the world for anti-Semitic incidents, and they said that in 2012 there was a 30% increase in anti-Semitic attacks. Do you believe that the world has forgotten the horrors of the Holocaust?
I think that the anti-Semitic spirit, sadly, is very strong in this world still. Like I said before, I believe that Satan has an agenda to wipe out the Jewish people. We saw it all throughout history. We see it back in the story of Moses. Pharaoh tries to wipe out the Jewish male babies. We saw it with Esther, the story of Esther, where Haman wanted to exterminate the Jewish people. We see it in the Psalms, the enemies of Israel saying, let's wipe the nation of Israel out as a people, that they be remembered no more. And of course, the Lord hasn't allowed this to happen. And modern history, we're seeing it too. We saw it in the Inquisition and, of course, the Holocaust. Hitler had the agenda to wipe out the Jewish people. And this anti-Semitic spirit, sadly, is very strong still.
I know something that you want to discuss in this program, which is often overlooked when it comes to actually studying the Holocaust, studying anti-Semitism, what happened, and that was Hitler's own personal fascination and involvement in the occult. How much do you believe that contributed to the murder of 6 million precious Jewish lives in the start of World War II?
I think the occult influence in the Nazi Party is irrefutable, and there's an excellent book by Erwin Lutzer called Hitler's Cross that really opened my eyes to this unseen area of Nazi history. And Hitler himself was very much involved in the occult. There's an account of when Hitler, in his early 20s, visited the Hofburg Library in Vienna. And in the Hofburg Library, there's a spear that allegedly is the spear that pierced the side of Christ. And it's an object that's been used as a talisman by occultic practices throughout history. And the mystery or the story that goes with it says whoever unlocks the mystery of this spear will rule the world. And Hitler was really fascinated by this and fascinated by the occult. And he says, and his friend also records in his diary, who was there at the time, that Hitler when he heard the story and this power that this spear allegedly held, he spent hours looking at the spear, and he tells the story that he had this experience of basically promising to do whatever necessary if he could be powerful. And I think that then when we see Hitler come to power, there's signs that he was definitely acting under the influence of the demonic. When he got up to give his speech, his inner circle would say that it was as if something would come upon him when he would give up to give a speech. And we all know how charismatic and powerful a speaker he was. And they would report that when he would come down off the stage after a speech, he would be sick, or it was like this thing would leave him and he would fall to the ground. And this is documented in the book Hitler's Cross. And so I think it is an interesting element, and it doesn't take any of the guilt or blame off of Hitler and his inner circle that were dabbling or very much involved in the occult, but it's a little window into what they really believed. You know, Hitler liked to associate himself with the Christian church, but this is not really what he believed. He was definitely involved.
Yeah, because one thing
demonic things.
I remember reading and also researching is the fact that what Hitler tried to do was to take Christ out of Christmas.
Right.
So his first intention was to destroy Judaism, destroy Jewish life, not only in Germany, but all across Europe. But also then, if he was successful in his task, then he wanted to destroy Christianity and actually model the Third Reich on pagan practices and occultic practices and create a new pagan Germany.
Yeah, it's clear that Hitler was anti-God and just the essence of evil. And what's interesting and a challenge I'd like to give to our viewers is, you know, there was the state church in Germany, the Lutheran church at the time, and they gave themselves over to Hitler and Hitler became the head of the church, the state church in Germany. And there was such a contrast between the German Christians who were part of the Nazi church as opposed to the confessing church. And there's names you would recognize from that, like Bonhoeffer and Niemöller, and their character and their theology that said, no, we will not stand for what Hitler is trying to do. We will not see people persecuted and treated this way. They understood the sanctity of life, the value of life, the preciousness of the Jewish people and the other people that Hitler was oppressing. And that's such a contrast to the people that were in the state church at the time, who were willing to be fighters in Hitler's army and who were not willing to risk their own lives or their families to stand up against Hitler. And I would just really challenge our viewers, what is your theology? What is your doctrine? Does it line up to the scriptures? And is it something that, if a similar opportunity arose again, would you act like Niemöller and Bonhoeffer? Would you stand up for what is right, even if it's incredibly difficult, even if it means risking or losing your own life? Or do you have the sort of doctrine that would allow you to just go with the flow, go with whatever culture, whatever thing is popular at the time? And I think Psalm 139, at the end of it, the psalmist says that we must test our hearts, or we must allow God to test and examine our hearts and see if there's any evil way in us and lead us in the way everlasting. And I would really challenge our Christian viewers to ask God to show you your thoughts, your beliefs, and if they line up with Scripture, and if they line up with God's heart, God's desire, in every way, including the way that he views the Jewish people and his love for them. And I would just like to leave that challenge.
It's a good challenge. I think it's very, very important that that it's right to get the right theological perspective. And, if we actually partake in evil, we become evil. And that's clearly what happened in Germany. But I really want to talk now about the actual ghetto. I think in the Warsaw, 1/3 of the Jewish population was Jewish. But the Warsaw ghetto became the place where all the Jews of Poland, other places in Eastern Europe, were really rounded up. Right. So we got original archive footage now of what life was like in the Warsaw ghetto. Hello and welcome back to the Middle East Report. We saw in that clip there we had an original archive of the Jewish Warsaw ghetto, as we saw in that clip. We're now joined on the phone by Trudy Gold, who is the Director of Holocaust Studies at the London Jewish Cultural Centre. Trudy, hello and welcome to the Middle East Report.
Hello, Simon.
Trudy, it's a great pleasure to have you on the programme today. Can you tell us why the Nazis decided to round up the Jews and put them in ghettos, and why we saw a real separation from the Jewish community and those of the Poles living in Poland?
Okay, you've got to remember that right from the beginning of Hitler's rise to power, anti-Semitism was one of the central platforms of his whole policy. And what you saw in Germany and then in Austria and in the Czech lands was the gradual social, legal and political exclusion of the Jews from society. Then, of course, with the invasion of Poland, he has to deal with the largest Jewish population in Europe. Warsaw, by the way, was the largest Jewish city in Europe. And at this stage, there's a big debate amongst historians as to whether at this stage the Nazis intended to murder all the Jews. But what we see happening is a holding operation. They decide to push all the Jews out of the Polish population. And remember also their treatment of Poland was absolutely appalling, because take on this notion of Nazi race theory. If the Jews were the enemy by blood, then the Slavic peoples were regarded as sort of the bottom of the pile. And the treatment of Poles during the Second World War was appalling. Anyway, going back to the Jewish issue, what they decide to do is to separate the Jews from the rest of society. So what you begin to see is the establishment of ghettos throughout the whole of Poland. And of course the largest was in Warsaw, which had the largest concentration of Jews in Europe, as I've already mentioned. So it's actual racial policy in action here.
Yeah. And what was so interesting that I've been just come back from Israel, Trudy, and attended the official Yom HaShoah memorial service at Yad Vashem. And then the next day we had an incredible tour of Yad Vashem, which is an incredible museum that archives everything that happened in the Holocaust. And what was so interesting, that our tour guide, who was the daughter of a survivor, told us that the Nazis filmed the Warsaw ghetto, particularly when a lot of the Jewish people became sick and ill, as part of their propaganda purposes, to show that the Jewish people are sick and ill as part of the eradication policy of the Nazis and part of their propaganda.
They even used scientific, sort of pseudo-scientific language. The most notorious of the Nazi propaganda films is called The Eternal Jew. And in it, they took people from the Warsaw ghetto and they showed how they were degenerates. It's absolutely very painful to watch it even to this day, because obviously we know what happened to these unfortunate individuals. But it's all part of a theory, Simon. What is happening is the Nazis, with their race pyramid, want to prove to their own citizens back home that they're clearing the world of what they saw as a bacillus, a disease.
And Trudy, as well, when we see and we learn about the Jewish ghettos, and often we learn that the Nazis carried out the liquidation of the ghettos. Why did it take until really 1943, with the Jewish uprising in the ghetto, for the Jewish people to actually realise their fate, as so many were sent to the gas chambers like Treblinka?
Oh God, you've asked one of the great questions. Simon, you've got to think about your own family situation. You've got to take on the belief that people hate you enough to murder your grandparents and your babies. And also think how the Germans dealt with resistance. I suppose the most important case from the Jewish point of view is Kristallnacht. In July of 1938, the Nazis began deporting Polish-born Jews living in Germany back to the Polish border. A young man whose family was included in that, a man called Herschel Greenspan, was studying in Paris, and he went into the German embassy and shot the third attaché. the response to that was Kristallnacht, the night of the smashing of the glass, when Jews were murdered, property was destroyed, synagogues were burnt, and then the community was fined. That's one act of resistance. Now think about general resistance as well. Think about what happened when Heydrich, the real monster, the beast man, although he was incredibly well educated, which is another side issue, he was murdered or executed by a group of Czech partisans. The village they came from, Nedice, was completely razed to the ground. The men all shot and the women taken to concentration camps. So the first thing, if you resist, what is going to happen to you? You know when resistance happened, when they knew they were going to die? When your children are with you, you still hope. When your parents are with you, you still hope. We go from the realms of history into the realms of psychology. And they were incredibly brave. They held out longer than the whole of Poland. There were lots of examples of Jewish resistance. I mean, in Auschwitz, a group of Sonderkommando blew up a crematorium. In Sobibor, the whole camp erupted. The whole camp broke out. But it tended to happen when they'd lost hope of life.
That's really interesting. Also, I think very, very significant. Can you tell us a little bit, Trudy, about the leader? I've got his name here, if I can pronounce it properly. Sorry, just
Mordechai Anielewicz, you're talking about.
Yes, that's the guy. Yes.
Yeah,
thank you. Help me out there.
He was such a young man when he died. I mean, he was born in 1919. He died in 43. He came from a left-wing Zionist background. And he actually, when the Germans invaded Poland, he escaped actually to the east of the country. And then, of course, the Soviet army invaded. He went to Vilna and he tried to convince his colleagues to fight the Germans. He then attempted to cross the Romanian border to open up a route for young Jews to get into Palestine, but he was caught and thrown into a Soviet jail. It's when he's released, he returns to Warsaw, I think it was in January 1940, with his girlfriend Mira, and by the summer of 42, he's traveling, he visits Southwest, and he finds out about the deportation to Treblinka. And when he returns to the ghetto towards the end of 42, he realizes they've just got to go for armed resistance. So he joined an organization, and he made a connection with the Polish underground government in London. And he was actually instrumental in one of the first acts of the uprising in January 1943. So he was a young man, desperately young, who believed passionately in fighting for freedom. I mean, if the Nazis hadn't have happened, he would have gone to Palestine. He was a left-wing Zionist. And, of course, he led the final uprising and died in the famous bunker Myla 18 with his girlfriend.
That's incredible, and I'm sure that his legacy lasts today. Now, what was so interesting, when I was at the memorial service and they were talking about Mordecai, what they said is that his actions at the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, in which they defied the Nazis for 27 days,
yes,
which was
they held
incredible,
up longer than the whole of Poland.
that this was the inspiration behind so many of the Jewish fighters who fought in Israel's War of Independence. What is the Jewish legacy of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 9?
Okay, can I tell you, Simon, a story? Let's go back to the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. There were two great heroes. One, of course, was Simon Bar Kokhba, who was proclaimed Messiah by Rabbi Akiva. And I'm sure your listeners know that in the Jewish tradition, Messiah, it does not mean divine, it means great leader. Bar Kokhba led the revolt against Rome and, of course, was defeated. There was another man in Jerusalem when Jerusalem was under siege, and he got his followers to smuggle him out of the city in a coffin. And he went to the Roman general, Vespasian, who later became emperor, and he said, please let me set up a study center. And out of his work came eventually the Palestinian Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. Because one of the extraordinary aspects of Jewish history is how the Jews survived as a people for 2,000 years without a country. So really, if you think about Jewish history, Who is the real hero of the Jews? Ben Zakkai or Bar Kokhba? What happens post-Holocaust? It's almost too much to bear. If you think of the image of the Jew in 1945, and I know your viewers have been looking at footage of the Warsaw Ghetto, and then you think of the image of the Israeli army in 1967, when the rabbi of the army blew the shofar by the Western Wall, these young bronzed fighters. What is the hero of Israel? So, yes, on one level, the Israeli defense forces see themselves as the heirs to the tradition of Bar Kokhba. But what is the secret of the Jews maintaining their identity? It's a bit of both. And this is a clash in Jewish history, and it hasn't really been resolved. You've got to remember that we're commemorating 70th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. It's such a short time span in the history of the Jews. I don't know where we're going to go from here. But of course, Anielewicz, Bar Kokhba, these are the great heroes of Israel. But Absolutely. Who are the real heroes of Israel? I mean, my most inspirational character in the Warsaw Ghetto is actually Janusz Korczak. I don't know if you've talked about him. Before the war, he was one of the greatest educators in Poland. His real name was Henryk Goldsmith, and he was actually responsible for the Charter of Children for the League of Nations, and he went into the Warsaw Ghetto with his orphans, and he did everything to keep their minds alive and their bodies safe, and in the end he went with them to Treblinka because they shouldn't be frightened of the dark. I mean, who do you want for your hero? Do you want Mordechai? You want Janusz Korczak? Or do you want somebody like Emanuel Ringelblum, who kept a very close record of everything that happened in the ghetto, Absolutely. All the cultural associations, and his story? He buried his archive in milk churns, and after, of course, the Warsaw Uprising, when the city was razed to the ground, later on, 2 of the milk churns that contained his story were found. So there's another hero for you.
Absolutely. And of course the Bielski brothers as well.
Well, there is a connection between Nowogrodzek, of course, and the Warsaw Ghetto, because the army at Krakowa actually informed the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto that there had already been an uprising. So that's interesting too. That's an area that is being researched at the moment.
Fantastic. My final question to you, Trudy, as well. Can you share with our viewers what the London Jewish Cultural Centre is doing? Because I know you're doing incredible work, and you are such a fantastic historian in teaching about the Holocaust. But what are you doing to commemorate the Warsaw Ghetto uprising of April 1943?
Okay, we've got something rather special on. We have an exhibition of photographs that was actually taken by a German soldier in the summer of 41. His name was Willie George, and he went into the ghetto testing out his Leichner. In 1993, he had a meeting with a very close friend of mine who was my mentor, a man called Felix Scharf, whose grandfather was the rabbi of Oswiecim in Auschwitz. Can you imagine? Anyway, Felix survived the war because there was a numerous clauses at the Jagiellonian University, so he came to LSE and became the centre of sort of Middle European immigration in London. He was a fascinating man. Anyway, in 1993, this man, who was a Jew and a Pole and was doing a lot to reconcile Jewish and Polish relations, was approached by Willie George and given the photographs. And Felix gave a set of them to me. Unfortunately, he passed away. And they are extraordinary photos, a glimpse of nameless people, and we can presuppose that, of course, the majority of them were murdered by the Nazis. So by hanging this incredible exhibition, we're trying to give them back their faces, their names. We can't give them back their names, but what we can do is kind of pay tribute to a civilization that's been destroyed. Because if you think what Poland was like before the war, they had so many organizations, cultural organizations, Yiddish theatre, Yiddish cinema, religious organizations. They had nearly 50 Jewish newspapers.
That's incredible.
I mean, it was an incredible life. And so we're going to kind of pay tribute to that life and at the same time honour the dead. But I think it's also quite important to mention to your viewers that a lot of the survivors who go into schools today do it because they don't want it to happen to anyone else, and they see it is. I think for the future, I think that's the sort of issue we should be grappling with. How come this appalling event happened? And I'd also like to share with you the words of a very wise man, the late Rabbi Hugo Grin, himself a survivor. He said what the Nazis did was to reverse the Ten Commandments, where you can steal, you can kill, you can profane. And we've got to look at what creates that kind of world. So you have all these survivors who've been to hell, these magnificent people who are trying to alert young people to the dangers, and yet we're living in a world where it's happening to other people. So I think the real message of the Warsaw Ghetto as a symbol is that in the Warsaw Ghetto, people, many of them, by just living a little longer, triumphed. The human spirit is wondrous, and we ought to try and work out, and it's way beyond history, we're into the field of psychology, aren't we? What is it that brings out the beast in man and woman, and what creates the opposite? And with something like the Warsaw Ghetto, you've got a microcosm of the world.
Trudy, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today on the Middle East Report, and I'm going to have to get you back in our studios very soon. So I very much appreciate all the excellent work you're doing at the London
You're very welcome,
Centre.
Simon, and may I commend also the work that you're all doing. I think it's very, very important.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Melissa, you can't really get a greater expert on the Holocaust than Trudy Gold, and the work she's doing is incredible, particularly in pioneering Holocaust education studies on the national curriculum, and it was her hard work that has got that in so that schools are teaching about the Holocaust today. But as we look back at the Holocaust and we look back at what happened in the ghettos of 1943, it was just incredible that Jewish resistance fighters decided to defy the Nazis and stop them for 27 days. I'll tell you the figures I got here. I'd like you to comment on this one. That in 1942, Hitler decided to liquidate the ghettos. Within 18 months, he had more than 2 million Jews survive the ghettos, were deported to death camps. The Germans ordered the Jewish police in the Warsaw Ghetto to round up people for deportation. Approximately 300,000 men, women and children were packed into cattle cars and transported to Treblinka. And it wasn't so that only left a population between 55,000 and 60,000 in the ghetto. It's just absolutely remarkable, isn't it, the resistance by some of these Jewish characters, including the Bielski brothers.
It is. It's a story of courage, of bravery, of the human spirit, like Trudy said, and it's very inspiring. And it's not the only case in the Holocaust of the Jewish people being defiant against their against their Nazi oppressors. There's some other very interesting and equally or also inspiring stories. One story in particular, which I think is fascinating, is a story that comes out of Poland, where a Nazi officer commanded a Jewish tailor who was imprisoned to make him a coat to wear to a ball out of the Torah scrolls. And this, of course, would be desecrating the Torah scrolls and would be really offensive to the Jewish people, which is why this Nazi official was doing it as a jab at the Jewish people. And this tailor, who had no choice but to make this at the point of death, in his own cleverness, found a way to defy this Nazi, and he made this coat, but he chose as the fabric of the coat, he cut out the scripture. The curses in Scripture, especially from Leviticus 26, where all the curses of heaven are called down upon people that don't obey God and don't follow His ways. And so this Nazi, not being able to read Hebrew, puts on this jacket with all of the curses that God commands down on people that don't follow Him and don't honor Him.
And the other form of resistance that I learned that the Jewish people did whilst they were in the ghetto was to celebrate life by putting on plays and musicals and entertainment.
Yeah, the Jewish people are a marvelous example of understanding the sanctity of life, the value of life, the joy of life. And you see that in Israel, and you see that in the response after the Holocaust of how many marriages, how many births took place in the displaced person camps. And like you said, in the ghetto itself, they set up all sorts of theaters, musical opportunities, and artistic groups, study centers, and they continued to live and enjoy life.
Yeah, and also I think it's also important to remember, isn't it, Melissa, some of those courageous Gentile, in which they're called righteous amongst the nations, like Irina Sendler. Can you tell us something about Irina Sendler? Because her story is fascinating.
Absolutely. This is the story of a beautiful Christian Catholic lady who is a social worker, a Gentile lady, who single-handedly rescued 2,500 Jewish children out of the ghetto. She would smuggle them out either in ambulances or in tool chests or any way possible. And she was fearless in the face of certain death if she was caught. And she was caught and put into the camps. And I think we have a clip that tells some of her story.
Absolutely. We've got a clip to go to now that looks at the life of Irina Sendler, one of the righteous amongst the nations who actually defied the Nazis by rescuing Jewish children. And she's known as the mother of the Jewish children of the Holocaust.
Irena Sendler was a Polish Catholic nurse who worked in Warsaw during the Nazi occupation of Poland and saved 2,500 Jewish children from certain death. During that time, she worked for the Warsaw Social Services. After the creation of the Warsaw Ghetto, Irena Sendler was able to save many children by smuggling them out of the ghetto to save them from being deported to the concentration camps. She transported the children in ambulances as if they were sick from typhus, hid them in trash cans, tool chests, supply boxes or coffins, and later put them in convents and Polish Catholic families. She created an archive with the real identities of the children, so one day they could be reunited with their family members. She wrote on a strip of paper the Jewish names of the children with the new Polish name and addresses where they were taken. All of them she put in a jar, which she buried by a tree in a garden. In 1943, she was detained by the Gestapo and taken to prison, where she was brutally tortured. She never betrayed her mission, and she was sentenced to death. But a soldier freed her thanks to the intervention from the Polish resistance. At the end of the war, she was able to recover her archives, although most of the families of children she saved had died in concentration camps. In 1965, the organization Yad Vashem in Jerusalem granted her the title Righteous Among the Nations. During the last year of her life, she received thanks from many children she had saved and was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize.
I dopóki jeszcze będę żyła i dopóki mi sił starczy, to będę głosiła, że najważniejsze jest dobro.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report, and if you can watch the film on Irina Sendler's life, it's certainly well worth watching, an incredibly moving, incredibly powerful film, and she's a fantastic lady. Sadly, Melissa, we've got 2.5 minutes left of the program, but what can Christians today learn from incredible, courageous women like Irina Sendler?
I think she's such an example of courage, of character, of strength of character, of integrity, of understanding the value of life. In Genesis 1, we see that every person is created in the image of God and is important. And this was in such drastic contrast to the Nazi understanding, the social Darwinist understanding that some people are better than other people. Some people are better stock, and some humans aren't even really humans, or just the vermin of the earth. But this is not what the Bible teaches us. The Bible teaches us that every man and woman and child is created the image of God and is important, and that we need to have the strength of character to stand up for the sanctity of life and the value of human life.
Melissa, I just want to thank you very much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report. I know Stephen will be very proud. You've done a great job, so thank you for joining me today. And I want to thank you very much for watching this program today. It's so important that we remember Yom HaShoah. We remember what happened to the Jewish people over 70 years ago, but we also pay tribute to the courageous fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of April 1943, in which they defied the Nazis, they defied evil, and they raised the flag for the first time in Jewish history, the Jewish flag, in opposition to the hatred that they received from the Nazis. So let's once again pay tribute to the Holocaust survivors and those who perished in the Holocaust by making sure that this never happens again, by remembering the lesson of the Holocaust, that we have to confront evil, and where we see evil, we have to fight it. And I want to thank you so much for watching today's program, The Middle East Report. Thank you and goodbye.
Gray stone walls caging the souls of men witness the death of Jews as prey in vultures' hands. Voice of hope shattered the dark of night, rose on the ghetto walls. Last command, thou shalt not despair. To live with honor and die with honor. It was their message to us all. They gave their lives for our freedom. Through pain and agony, fought for humanity. We'll keep their memory. חלש ואמיץ לב, כמו הבני בר כוכבא, התריסו את סמכית של הריס, שחייתי לא בשביל ניצחון. עד מוות נלחמו, רק לעולם לאמור, עם שלי, בכבוד תזכור. To live with honor and die with honor. It was their message to us all. They gave their lives for our freedom. Through pain and agony, fought for humanity. We'll keep their memory. ביי הקירות אומרת מצבה עדו למאבק של אלה שכאן נפלו. At its steps flowers proclaim their praise to those who won't return but will remain forever in our hearts. To live with honor and die with honor. It was their message to us all. They gave their lives for our freedom. Through pain and agony, fought for humanity. We'll keep their memory alive. Through pain and agony, fought for humanity. We'll keep their memory. Must keep their memory. We'll keep their memory.